All right, good morning, everyone. We're glad you're here with us today on this blustery, from what I understand, for you all, December morning. As always, we're just going to do quick introductions. I know some of you have been on some of the previous ones, but just to make sure. So if you could just very quickly introduce yourself with your name, your organization, experience with AmeriCorps, and with writing the AmeriCorps grant. I don't know which one of you wants to go first.
I'll go first. I'm Ann Wilbur, and I work with Communities and Schools of Hampton Roads. We have not done AmeriCorps before, but we are part of a national network that other affiliates have AmeriCorps programs. And so we're venturing down that road, and I have not written an AmeriCorps grant before.
Great, thank you, Ann. Elizabeth, would you like to introduce yourself?
I am a Vista working with Serve Virginia. I've been here for 4 months. That is the extent of my experience with AmeriCorps. And I'm just attending this as a way to learn more about the work that they do here at Serve Virginia and understand the other side of it.
Great, well, welcome. And thank you for your service. Amy Salinas, who's been on some of the other webinars, is actually training Vista members currently in Dallas, Texas. So she's been there part of this week. Before we jump into performance measures, I just wanted to see if you all had any questions based on the previous 2 webinars or any of the On3 Learn courses, if you've taken those, before we jump into kind of the performance measure module. All right, well then let's jump in here. We're going to talk about some brief background. The next couple of slides you've seen if you've attended the other webinars, but they're also tied into performance measures. So these are the 4 AmeriCorps guiding principles. And that first one of getting things done is talking about a focused impact and activities, and also the evidence-informed piece. And those activities are going to be recorded within your performance measures, which we're talking about today. To demonstrate that impact, you will have to have a national or a performance measure as part of your grant application. And that will include both an output and an outcome. And over time, those performance measures help lay a foundation of evidence for your programming. Okay. So let's talk about actually the performance measures themselves. There's lots that you can choose from, so we'll go over all those 2 today. In eGrants, you will select the performance measure module, and we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end, because it's a little bit more nuanced than the other parts of eGrants. It is kind of its own separate module, so when you click on it, it's going to kind of boot you into this other module, and then you have to go back to your application when you're finished. Each of the performance measure sections has a 2,000 character limit, including spaces. And eGrants doesn't give you a red flag or warning signal that you've gone over. It literally just cuts off your text. So if you're not catching that, then the reviewers will certainly catch it because something will be missing at the end there. So what is performance measure when we look at it? It's that ongoing systematic process of tracking your program's output and outcomes. Okay. They are a required element of your AmeriCorps grant and serve as a major part of your reporting to the Virginia Commission and AmeriCorps. They really help to tell part of the story of your program and should represent the primary thing that your members do. The measures you select should represent things you can reasonably count and on which you can share meaningful impact along your program's primary intervention. Okay, we don't want to make it super complicated. Of course, we want to have good data collection, but it doesn't have to be like super complicated in relation to our performance measures themselves. As I said, you are required to select one aligned set of performance measures. So that means one output and one outcome that correspond to your primary intervention. And these measures have to be aligned, which means that the numbers and results outlined in both the the output and outcome, address the same service activity and focus on the same group of beneficiaries or service recipients. Last week, Amy talked about the logic model where you're going to report outputs and outcomes. One of those sets will be captured in your performance measures. You're going to talk about multiple outputs and outcomes, but for your grant purposes, you don't have to measure all of those. You just have to select one set of those for your performance measures. Okay, so your outputs are those counts. They represent the number of people served, the number of services services delivered, miles or acres treated if you're in an environmental program, or projects completed. It is literally just a count. Okay? And then the second piece is the outcomes. And outcomes are those expected changes in the population, community, or area served that result from your activities and fall along a continuum of change. It could be either short, all the way up to long-term results. Okay, those short-term changes are knowledge, skills, and our attitudes. When we talk about medium-term outcomes, that's changes in behaviors or actions. And long-term outcomes are those changes in conditions or status. Okay. You can choose any one. Your outcome could fall into any one of these categories depending upon what you are measuring. So let's look at a couple different examples. And looking at these examples, if you are measuring, we'll go back here a little bit, one of those short-term, right? Knowledge, skills, or attitude. For this one, that could be a change in thought or feeling. So as an example, caregivers feel she has more social support after receiving respite services. That could be an outcome for attitude and belief. For knowledge and skill, it could be a change in understanding or ability, so what a person learns. So a student improves their reading ability after attending tutoring. Behavior, we're looking at changes in actions, conducts, or habits. And an individual could increase their intake of vegetables and fruits after participating in health education classes. And then lastly, those longer term ones, those condition ones, change in situation or circumstance. So for example, a family transitioned in a safe, affordable housing after receiving referrals and counseling, or communities receive a new after-school program because the youth organization's been able to build its capacity through AmeriCorps members to provide services. Okay, so your outcome could fall into any one of these categories depending upon what you are measuring. And you always want to go back to these definitions of what AmeriCorps has, whether it's changes in knowledge, skills, or attitudes, or they're short-term, behavior or actions are long-term, or medium-term, and condition or status are long-term. Okay. All right. It's important to understand that AmeriCorps and the Virginia Commission do not require that you have a set of performance measures for every single activity that members do. In the AmeriCorps performance measure instructions, they clearly state that all performance measures must reflect significant program activities whose outputs and outcomes are consistent with the applicant's core theory of change. Applicants are not expected to have performance measures for every program activity. Okay. The Notice of Funding Opportunity also states that AmeriCorps does not expect applicants to select performance measures to correspond to each and every potential member activity or community impact. AmeriCorps values the quality of performance measures over the quantity. Okay. All of your member activities are going to be captured in your logic model and in your grant narrative. You are just selecting one piece of that to measure for the purposes of performance measures. Okay. AmeriCorps provides you with instructions and a list of what we call national performance measures in each of the 7 AmeriCorps focus areas from which you can pick. Okay. But AmeriCorps also states that if you cannot find a national set of measures that fits your theory of change and logic model, then you can create your own, and we call those applicant determined measures, okay? Applicants, though, cannot create applicant determined outputs or outcomes that duplicate existing national performance measures. AmeriCorps it's probably been about 7 or 8 years, maybe even longer now, when AmeriCorps created these national performance measures. And part of the reasoning for that is everyone kind of had their own set of measures. So it's very hard to aggregate data and report that data to Congress. So as a part of that, they created these national performance measures that they want programs to look at first and foremost to see if they fit. Now they know that some programs are very different and will not fit, and that's why they give the opportunity for applicant determine. But having the national performance measures allows them to aggregate a larger chunk of data to be able to report that to Congress. Okay, and I would say the vast majority of AmeriCorps programs fit into one of those national performance measures. All right, so let's look at the national performance measure instructions. I'm going to kind of go back and forth here a little bit. Let me actually go to the performance measures. Okay, AmeriCorps puts out performance measure instructions, which you should be seeing on your screen now, every year. They haven't, for the national ones, they haven't really changed at all in the last few years, but every year when you apply for your grant, whether that's a recompete year or a continuation year, you want to make sure that you review these instructions again, okay, to make sure that you are aware of any changes. This is a 37-page document. At one point, it was like 80 pages. So they've condensed it a lot over the years. There is a table of contents, and these are clickable links. So if you need to hop really quick, that's a really nice feature that they do have. There's some information here on this page about the performance measures. A lot of it we just talked about, that you don't have to measure every single activity, that you can do an applicant determined if necessary. The big pieces start on page 4 and goes through page 11. And these are specific selection rules, and these rules have to be followed. So each focus area states specifically that if you choose this output, then you can choose from one of these outcomes, okay? For each output, there's either an outcome you have to select, or you can create your own applicant determined outcome. So, and since you're an education program, we'll jump down to education. So if we look at it, there's basically 3 areas, 3 objectives that programs can utilize in terms of education. The first one is school readiness, okay? Then we have K-12 success and post-high school. So really that whole education spectrum, pre-K all the way to college, okay? You'll notice the output is the same for all 3, ED1A. And that number letter combination is what you're going to list in your logic model under your output column. That's going to be the first thing you list in that logic model, okay? And that's number of individuals served, okay? When we look at the outcome section, there's multiple options depending upon which objective. For school readiness, the only option is number of children demonstrating gains in school readiness, okay? In terms of K-12 success, there's lots of, there's improved academic performance, there's graduating from high school on time, enrolling in post-secondary education or training, improved academic engagement or social emotional skills, increased attendance, or decreased disciplinary incidents. And then post-high school, there's only one also, and that's the number of students earning a post-secondary degree or technical certification. You'll notice there's 2 others listed down here. There's a teacher core, which is no longer applicable. For the national performance measures, you can only measure beneficiaries. You may not use these performance measures for AmeriCorps members, okay? AmeriCorps members can't be considered the beneficiaries for these. Years ago they were, which is why this teacher core is still there, because it could be an option in eGrants. And then you have the option for other education. Your output's going to be the same. It's going to be one of those national performance measure outputs, because it's It's very generic. It's number of individuals served. And then you could create your own applicant determined. We've had some programs measure things like growth mindset or resiliency, kind of things. A lot of times those do fall under the SEL one, but it kind of depends upon the nuances of that. And then this last column are interventions, okay? For the national performance measures, you can only select the interventions listed here. 8 grants may offer other options, but you can only choose from this list, okay, if you're using a national performance measure. So let's say your K-12 objective, your output is ED1A, and your outcome is ED5A. You can only choose from these interventions in relation to that performance measure set. You can choose as many as you want. There is no limit. You don't have to just choose one. Any of those interventions that apply to the activities your members are doing in relation to these performance measures should be selected. I've said a lot so far, so I want to see if there's any questions.
I've got a question about the outcomes. So we measure, we already have outcome measurement because we are data-based. So we measure attendance, behavior, and course performance as that's our numbers we report out to national and to funders and all that kind of thing. So would I just pick one of them, or do I pick all 3 of the things that we naturally measure as my outcomes?
I would pick one because your output number is the same, right? You're looking at the same set of students for all 3. I would pick the one that moves the needle the most.
Okay.
Right? Attendance is really hard because that's very much out of your control, for example. That's dependent upon family life, like all sorts of different programs tend to struggle with attendance more often than not. Behavior may be something that you can influence more. So that might be something. And that behavior could be translated to either the decreased disciplinary incidents, depending upon what you're looking at, or I was with a CIS program previously, and we measured the improved academic engagement.
Okay.
Because we felt too that attendance, behavior, and you mentioned one other, remind me.
Course performance, which is
course performance. Yeah.
Yeah. ABC.
All of those are influenced by academic engagement in many ways.
Okay.
The course performance one could be improved academic performance. But I know like in our program, members were meeting the students where they were at, what subject they were struggling with. So it could have been any subject. So it's really hard to measure improved academic performance across the board.
Yep.
Great question. Any other questions? I'm sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. I had COVID right before Thanksgiving and the tickle's not gone away. Okay. In terms of the performance measure instructions, when we go down to the actual measures, there's 3 key areas. Your definition of key terms, and then how to measure, collect data, and there is a note section, okay? The note section's not always provided. So let's look at that, how that translates. I'm gonna go, so I don't make you all too dizzy, I'm gonna go back up here and we'll stay in education. Okay, at the top of each focus area, there are focus area notes. That's my highlight. So programs should only opt into education performance measure if the measures reflect, again, that significant program activities. All individuals counted under these have to be beneficiaries, not AmeriCorps members. And then activities associated with these measures have to be carried out by AmeriCorps members or by volunteers directly recruited and supported by those AmeriCorps members. Okay. Each of these sections, you will see the actual output or outcome with that letter number combination. And then you're going to see a definition of key terms. This is really important. And this is where we see people kind of miss things a lot of times. So for example, in ED1A, individuals. So this is recipients of AmeriCorps supported services related to education and can include students enrolled in grades K-12. If your members are serving pre-K students also, you would not count them in this measure because that's considered school readiness, right? I'm sorry, if you're looking at the K-12 success objective. If you're looking at school readiness, then yes, it's grades K-12, it's out of school youth, it's preschool age children or individuals pursuing post-secondary education, okay? The second definition, served, is substantive engagement of individuals with a specific education goal, related goal in mind. And it can't not consist solely of mass dissemination of information such as email blasts, social media posts, or distributing pamphlets, okay? That definition of served, you will see carried out in other ones. So if we look at healthy futures, same thing. There's your definition of served with a specific health-related goal in mind instead of a specific education goal in mind. So what does this really mean? And this is kind of where people stumble a little bit. You will have a dosage that your beneficiaries will receive, right? How often the members meet with them, for how long, for what period of time. That is your overall program dosage. Let's say you are a math tutoring program. Your overall dosage could be 1 hour a week for 30 weeks, okay? So those members meet with that student for 1 hour a week for 30 weeks. Your definition of served is a subset of your overall dosage. So what is substantive enough engagement to start meeting the needle towards that improved math grade? It doesn't mean they've improved their math grade, but started to move the needle. So this program could set their definition of served as 1 hour a week for 6 weeks. Or they could set it to make it even easier because then you're having to track that 1 hour and you're having to track the weeks. It could be 6 hours of services, okay? Whatever you set your definition of served as, the individuals cannot be counted in your output unless they meet that definition, okay? Additionally, you want to make sure that it's easily trackable by the members on an individual beneficiary basis, because you have to be able to show that student 1, yes, met this definition. They had 6 hours of services. Student 2 only had 4, so they're not going to count in our output. Questions on that? Okay. This is where these definitions really come into play. And then the last section there is how to measure, collect data. So they say it should be a tracking mechanism that ensures an unduplicated count of individuals who have received services. Okay, you're going to aggregate all the data, but you have to be able to track it on an individual basis. There is one other section that could appear like a note section. So this one is ED 11, and it's number of students earning a post-secondary degree or technical certification. And the note is that programs can only select this measure if they are able to collect data during a 1-year grant period. That's the same for all of your measures technically, but because this is earning a post-secondary degree, they want to emphasize that. All of your performance measures should be able to be measured within your grant year, because you'll have to report, if your grant ends in August, you'll have to probably finish your final grant report around October, end of September is when most commissions have them. Okay. A couple other things in the performance measure instructions I want to go over. Go way down to the bottom. One of the pieces is, because you're not measuring all your member activities. Let's say, give an example of a program that has capacity building members, right? They're doing capacity building, kind of indirect services for 50% of their time, and they're doing environmental stewardship focused education services for the other 50%, okay? Or let's say they're doing capacity building to make it easier, 60%, and the education environmental stewardship piece, 40%, okay? So the primary service activity is capacity building. That is what your AmeriCorps performance measures would be on. but you also have to indicate that 40% of their time is going to this environmental stewardship focus area. So what you have to do is you have to, like in this, you have to allocate that time based on the member service year, or MSY. MSY is really just the same as full-time equivalent, or FTE. So you'll see every member type right here has an MSY number associated with it. Okay, and it's weird government math. We'll talk about this a little bit more on our budget one, but quarter time members, instead of 0.25 like you would think, it's 0.264555027. Okay, and you have to use that entire number. So if you have members doing multiple activities or multiple focus areas, you have to tell AmeriCorps they're spending this amount of time in this activity on this focus area, and they're spending this amount of time in this activity in this focus area. We're not going to have performance measures for them all, but at the beginning of the performance measure section in eGrants, you have to allocate that time. Okay. Here's an example here laid out. So you have 135 members. All members spend most of their time to the K-12 success, but some do pre-K. The program's full and half-time members also spend time with those pre-K students. So 50% of their time for full-time members and 20 for half. So the K-12 success, you'll notice that they've allocated the full-time members at 50% times the MSY. So that equals 50 MSYs. And then the half-time members, they have 5 members at that time, and they've allocated 80% of their time for 2 MSYs. Okay, so they're doing that for every single type of member that they have, and then they're doing the same for school readiness. So you'll notice that the total MSYs towards K-12 success is 60.63, and towards school readiness is 50.5. Okay, in looking at this, the K-12 would be their primary activity, so that's what their performance measure should be on. Wow, and this is really hard to see. In eGrants, and I have a better slide of this, in eGrants, then you're going to allocate that out. So your members, you'll notice they only have 135 members, but this says 240 because you're counting members twice because they're allocated to both of those. But the MSYs equals the total MSYs for the program. You can't exceed your MSYs, you can exceed the members. Does that make sense? This is the trickier part of the performance measures. Okay, get this out. And then the next section in the performance measure instructions is a checklist, which is really helpful, especially if you're new to performance measures, just a checklist of things that they're looking at. And then lastly, FAQs. These are really great to look over too. One of the ones that comes up often is around, can you do a sampling? And AmeriCorps does not allow sampling. So you do have to be able to measure every single beneficiary that you are serving. Okay. I should correct that statement. They don't allow sampling in many cases. You can ask for permission. I haven't seen it happen very often. I have programs that measure 2,000 beneficiaries all the time. So it's just getting those systems in place for measurement. All right, those are the national performance measure instructions. This year, they've also put out 2 other sets of instructions, okay? The second set of measures that they have put out are related to Public Health AmeriCorps. Previously, Public Health AmeriCorps was its own separate kind of funding through AmeriCorps and the CDC. This year, they are all together under the AmeriCorps State National Funding source. Okay, the only 2 focus areas for public health are healthy futures and capacity building. And these are very similar to the national performance measures with a little bit of nuance. So if you're looking at being designated as a public health AmeriCorps program, which is a priority area, you would choose performance measures from this section. I know youth mental health core is coming up, so some of those programs may be selecting from the public health guidelines depending upon the service activities their members are doing. If you aren't sure whether you meet the public health priority area, in the mandatory supplemental information, there is a section on the public health AmeriCorps priority area, and there are specific things that you have to meet in order to qualify for this priority area and then utilize those performance measures. There's specific training, there's specific goals. So if you have any questions, you can look that up in the mandatory supplemental information. And then the last performance measure instructions that they put out was an applicant determined performance measure supplement and suggested applicant determined performance measures for Native nations and bridge building. Okay, the bridge building piece is brand new. Applicant determined they've had for a while, but they've never put out any specific instructions. So if you're looking at doing applicant determined, this walks you through. This also has some screenshots of e-grants, which are helpful because applicant determined slightly different in e-grants. And then if you're a Native Nations program, it talks about the measures that you can use for your program, along with, let me see if I can get down to this quicker. Bridge building is the newest kind of program model that they've given guidance on. The difference with bridge building programs versus other programs or other performance measures, I should say, is that they do allow in the bridge building measures for individuals to be either program beneficiaries or national service members. And that is new. Any questions on any of those pieces? All right. So let's talk a little bit more about entering the performance measures into e-grant. And then after this, I'll show you a sample performance measure also, okay? And the reason I wanted to kind of go over this a little bit, this is outlined in the AmeriCorps performance measure on 3 Learn course, but it's a little bit more nuanced and it kind of trips people up sometimes. So I just want to make sure you guys have a clear understanding of it. I'm not going to go through all the pieces, but kind of give you an overview. In eGrant, there'll be the performance measure option, and then it'll ask you to click here to enter performance measures, which, like I said, kind of takes you to this other module. It's seamless. It'll just hop you over to this other module, which looks like this part of your screen. And then you're just going to click begin. And then it's going to walk you through the different sections. So you're going to have to click your focus area, very much aligned with like that selection rules we looked at in the instruction. You're going to pick your focus area. And then after you pick your focus area, those objectives are going to appear. So on the left side of your screen, you'll see education, you see K-12 success, post-high school education support, school readiness, just like they were laid out in the selection rules. Once you pick the one that you applies to your program, this program is a post-high school education support program, then those interventions are going to be listed, okay? As I said, some of these interventions may not be on the intervention list for this particular objective. So you want to make sure that you're only choosing ones that are listed in the rules and in the instructions, okay? It'll have you pick a primary focus area and primary intervention. And then if you so choose, you can select a secondary focus area and secondary intervention. Okay. And then from there, this is what we were just talking about. You're going to have to allocate your members. and their MSY or their full-time equivalent percentage of time. Hold on one sec, y'all, sorry. I'm sorry, y'all, I had to pop in a cough drop or else I'm gonna be coughing the rest of the time here. Okay, so you're gonna allocate your total, you're gonna enter your total MSY for the program, and then you're gonna allocate by focus area and objective. You could have education focus area and have, like we looked at that example, K-12 success and school readiness, or you could have two different focus areas such as education and economic opportunity, like on the screen here, okay? So they've allocated half of their MSYs to education and half to economic opportunity, right? So you'll have to do that. Once you allocate your members and MSYs, then you're going to start entering your output and outcomes. And as I said earlier, each of these fields has a 2,000 character limit, including spaces, and eGrants doesn't tell you when you're over, it just cuts you off, okay? At the end, it's going to give you a summary, and you have to validate your performance measures. So once you enter them, you have to validate them. If you come back at a later date and make any changes, then they have to be revalidated. Your grant cannot be submitted until your performance measures are validated. Okay. And then you'll click at the top of the screen, that red box, back to eGrants application. Okay. Questions on that?
I'm just curious, what exactly, I mean, so you just push a button that says validate. Is that just sort of checking it against the
It's checking
options?
Yeah, it's checking it. It's not checking against necessarily the options, like the objectives and pieces. It's kind of checking two things is where I usually see errors come up. A, that your MSY and number of members do not match your budget. It'll usually, if you've entered your budget, it'll check against that. And B, that you've allocated them all to a focus area, because it has to all align in that area.
Okay.
Okay. It's a little bit smart, but not very smart.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so let's look at a sample performance measure. This is a performance measure template that is part of the On3Learn performance measure course. The one in the course is very generic. This one is set up for ED1A and ED5A. And this is actually, Anne, may be really helpful to you, and it will be sent out as a resource after today's webinar. But this is set up from kind of from a CIS program, actually. Okay. On the left side is everything that is required in eGrants, kind of like what we just looked at. It really mirrors, like you can copy and paste this straight into eGrants. We don't suggest, as Amy said in the narrative and logic model portion, you do everything in Word or Excel and then copy it into eGrants. It's very difficult to work directly in eGrants to make changes, so it's best to finalize everything and then put it in there. So this performance measure guidance is broken up into 3 sections: your overall general information, then your output, and then your outcome. So for overall general, you just pick what the applicable objective is. For this program is doing ED1A and ED5A, which we'll talk about in a second. You're going to create a short title, and then you're going to indicate the number of MSYs and members allocated to these particular measures. The next section is the problem statement. And a lot of these sections are misnamed or not very clearly named about everything that they have to include. Okay, so the more that you can look at the guidance template, the better. So we've outlined 6 different items that have to be addressed in the problem statement section. We don't want you to do 1, 2, 3. This is not AmeriCorps' list. This is our list based on AmeriCorps' requirements, okay? So it's going to be in paragraph form. You just want to make sure that you're addressing all of these items. So for the problem section, that's describe the problem, include statistics to describe the problem. A lot of that information can be pulled from the logic model or narrative. And then who are the beneficiaries served? And it should be a really clear, detailed definition. How are they selected? Again, make sure you include the criteria for selecting them. And then describe how the measures align with the problem and explain how targets were set for the output and the outcome. So this program talks about how dropping out of school happens and what the information is around there. You know, they list statistics. In the 2022-23 school year, 18,000 students were considered at risk of dropping out of school and 19,000 economically disadvantaged in the schools that this CIS program serves. Okay. The elementary schools also have a large percent of economically disadvantaged students, as noted in these statistics here. And then they say that they're going to be serving at-risk elementary school students in these different school districts, and the at-risk students are eligible for services if they meet one of these criteria. Okay, and then staff and school personnel work together to identify and serve the most at-risk students. Okay. And then lastly, they talk about kind of how their intervention is connected to the problem and then how they set their target. Okay. Then you have your selected interventions, again, from that selection rule. And so they're focusing on tutoring and mentoring. And then you have your interventions. You have to describe the member activities in relation to the measures and the dosage. And that's frequency, intensity, and duration for each beneficiary and why that's sufficient to meet the outcome. Right? So they talk about that members are going to be assigned students with academic deficiencies who are identified by teachers and the student support team based on assessments that have been taken. And then they talk about that the students will meet with the members twice a week for a minimum of 30 minutes per session. Right? Then we get into the output. So this output is 81A, number of individuals served. Your target should be ambitious but realistic. And then you have options for method. Okay. They chose tracking system, and they talk about the database that is maintained by our Texas Education Agency, and that students will have an identifier within that system, how that every site uses this, and there's kind of ways to avoid duplication. And then they describe their definition of serve, how we talked about that's a really key piece to this because you can't count them in the output until they meet that. And so their definition of served is after 10 sessions, resulting in 5 hours of academic support. And then lastly, they're looking at number of students with improved academic performance. So of their 312 students, they anticipate 265 of those will have improved academic performance based on standardized testing. Okay. They do 4 assessments a year, and each of their school districts doesn't use the same one. So some of those school districts use MAP testing, some use iStation. So they list that information there. And then the important piece in the outcome is number 6 here, the gain or amount of progress to count as improved academic performance. Like, how can you say that you can't just say, you know, if they're in the outcome, they are improved academic performance. What is that scale to do that? So they've listed that a 10-point increase in MAP growth test and 1 level increase in iStation and Imagine will represent improvement in either math, reading, or both. Each student, however, will be only counted once if they were both tutored for math and reading. Okay. So that's kind of how your performance measures will be laid out. And this is an example that I'll share along with the PowerPoint for you all. Questions on that? All right. All right, so just a reminder of the resources that you do have available to you. The Serve Virginia website with the AmeriCorps funding pages there. You have the On3 Learn applicant courses. Performance measures is one of those. And then next week, we will be doing our last webinar of this series on the budget. Okay. So come with your math head in place.